My daughter-in-law decided her mother was the best grandmother and completely cut me out of my grandchildren's lives. I didn't argue. I simply went to her mother's hometown and talked to old neighbors. It turned out that the perfect grandmother had serious legal problems in her youth. I simply sent copies of the old court decisions to my son in an anonymous letter. If you're ready for this journey, make sure you hit that subscribe button and give this a like so you don't miss the updates. And let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. It's always lovely to see where everyone is. Let's be clear about one thing right from the start. I adored my grandchildren. It wasn't just the typical cookie baking, story reading kind of love. It was a deep, soul-level connection. Leo, who was 7 when this all started, had my late husband's eyes and his inquisitive, engineering mind. He could spend hours with me in the garage, taking apart old radios and trying to put them back together. And little Mia, who was 5, was pure sunshine. We had a standing Tuesday appointment for fancy tea, which usually involved apple juice in my best china and us wearing ridiculously feathered hats I'd bought at a thrift store. I was that grandma, the one on the floor building forts, the one with glitter permanently stuck in the lines of her hands, the one whose phone gallery was 90% out-of-focus pictures of little faces beaming with joy. For the first few years, everything was wonderful. My son, Mark, had married his college sweetheart, Tiffany, and while she and I were never going to be best friends, we had a cordial, respectful relationship. She was a bit high-strung, let's say, very focused on appearances, on having the perfect organic snacks, the most enriching extracurriculars, the Instagram-perfect family photo. I come from a generation where you let your kids make mud pies and get a few scrapes. So we had our differences, but I respected her as their mother. I followed her rules, I held my tongue, and I cherished the time I was given with my grandbabies. The shift was so gradual that at first I barely noticed it. It was like the tide going out, one tiny ripple at a time. It started with the arrival of Tiffany's mother, Dolores, who moved to our city shortly after Mia was born. Dolores was, in Tiffany's eyes, the gold standard. She was a widow, impeccably dressed, with a soft, cooing voice and an opinion on everything, always presented as gentle, loving advice. "Oh, Susan, that's a lovely thought, but I just read a study in modern parenting that says imaginative play should be child-led. Maybe we let Leo decide what he wants to do instead of the radio project." Slowly but surely, my role began to shrink. My Tuesday teas with Mia were canceled because Dolores, whom the kids were instructed to call Lolly, had signed Mia up for a French immersion class for preschoolers. My garage time with Leo was replaced by coding camps that Lolly had found and paid for. If I offered to babysit on a Friday night, Tiffany would hesitate and say, "Oh, that's so sweet, Susan, but Mom has already offered. She's just so in tune with their new schedules, you know? It's seamless." Seamless, that was the word she used. I was apparently full of seams. I was the lumpy, hand-sewn quilt, and Dolores was the 1,000 thread count Egyptian cotton sheet. My son, Mark, God love him, is a peacemaker. He's always been caught between the strong women in his life, first me and his late father, now me and his wife. He saw the shift happening, I know he did. I'd see a flicker of guilt in his eyes when he'd call to say, "Hey, Mom, we won't be able to make it for Sunday dinner. Tiff and her mom planned a trip to the Interactive Science Museum." But he'd just sigh and do whatever it took to keep the peace in his own home. I understood it, but that didn't make it hurt any less. The real turning point, the moment I knew this was a campaign and not just a series of coincidences, was Leo's 7th birthday. I had spent weeks planning a surprise for him. His dad, my dear Frank, was an amateur astronomer, and he'd left behind a beautiful, high-powered telescope. I had it professionally cleaned and set it up in my backyard. I bought books on constellations for kids and planned a whole night sky explorer party for him and his little friends, complete with planet-themed cupcakes and a scavenger hunt. I called Mark, so excited I could barely contain myself, to tell him my plan. He cleared his throat. "Oh, wow, Mom, that sounds amazing. But, Tiff and Lolly already handled the party."
Yeah, Lolly booked the entire VIP room at that new laser tag arena downtown. She's having it catered. It's a whole thing. Tiffany sent out the Evites last week. I checked my email while still on the phone. Nothing. No invitation, not even a courtesy copy. "Mark?" I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "I didn't get an invitation." The silence on his end was deafening. I could practically hear him wringing his hands. "Oh my God, Mom, I'm so sorry. I thought I'll talk to her. It must have been an oversight." But it wasn't an oversight. When Mark called back an hour later, his voice was tight with frustration. Tiffany had claimed my email must have gone to spam. She was terribly sorry. Of course I was invited. But then came the kicker. "And Mom," Mark said, sounding pained, "Tiff says, well, she and Lolly feel that the telescope thing is maybe a bit too much. It might overshadow the main party they worked so hard to plan. Tiff is asking if maybe you could just bring the cupcakes and, let Lolly be the star of the show this time. She's the one who paid for it all, after all." And just when he thought he had me backed into a corner, he forgot who he was dealing with. Stick with me, because you'll want to see how this plays out. I didn't go to the laser tag party. I called on the morning of, feigning a sudden migraine, my voice brittle over the phone. Tiffany's relief was practically audible. "Oh no, Susan, you poor thing. Well, you rest up. We'll miss you." Liar. Lolly got on the phone moments later, her voice dripping with that fake, syrupy concern. "Susan, dear, you take care of yourself. The children will be so sad, but I'll be sure to take lots of pictures for you." She was marking her territory, and I was being politely but firmly shoved out of the pride. The pictures she posted online were a masterpiece of curated joy. Lolly, front and center, wearing a custom-printed t-shirt that said "Leo's VIP Grandma." My grandson was holding up a brand-new, expensive drone that I knew Lolly had brought him. My son Mark stood slightly behind everyone, a forced smile on his face. The caption Tiffany wrote was the final twist of the knife. "So incredibly grateful for my amazing mom who gives our children the world and makes every day magical. Feeling so blessed to have the best Lolly ever guiding my babies. Hashtag best Lolly, making memories." There was not a single mention of me. It was a public erasure. To the entire world of their social media, I simply didn't exist as a grandmother to Leo and Mia. I was no longer part of the narrative of my own son's family. And as I sat there staring at my phone, the deep, gut-wrenching hurt began to harden into something else. It was cold, it was quiet, but it was strong. It was resolve. Dolores played the part of the flawless matriarch so perfectly. She spoke of her idyllic childhood in a small town in rural Ohio, her storybook marriage to her late husband, and her years as a devoted stay-at-home mom. It was all so clean, so wholesome. But over the years, there had been little things, tiny, insignificant slips that I had filed away without thinking. A strange comment she once made at a Thanksgiving dinner about how some people just know how to make their mistakes disappear. An oddly fierce reaction she had when a movie we were watching featured a character getting arrested for shoplifting. She'd laughed it off, saying she just hated seeing people get away with things. At the time, I'd thought nothing of it. But now, sitting in the quiet of my home, scrolling through the evidence of my own obsolescence, those little inconsistencies started to flicker like warning lights. Tiffany worshipped her mother. Mark, by extension, was forced to accept this flawless narrative. If Dolores was the pillar of perfection, then I, with my messy garage projects and store-bought cupcake mix, must be the flawed, second-rate alternative. The entire campaign to cut me out was predicated on the myth of Saint Dolores of the suburbs. I thought about it for a week.
I let the anger and the hurt settle down from a boil to a low, steady simmer. I wasn't going to scream or cry or cause a scene. That's what they expected me to do. That would only prove their point, that I was difficult, dramatic, and not good for the children. No. My late husband Frank didn't just teach Leo about circuits and wires, he taught me about strategy. You don't win by yelling, Susan, he used to say. You win by finding the one loose screw the other guy forgot to tighten.
So I booked a flight. I didn't tell Mark or anyone else where I was going. I just packed a small bag, rented a sensible car, and drove 2 hours from the Columbus airport to the small, sleepy town of Northwood, Ohio. The place Dolores always spoke of with such gauzy, nostalgic fondness. It was time, I figured, to go see where the world's best grandmother got her start. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I had a feeling, a deep gut feeling, that somewhere in that idyllic little town, I'd find Dolores's loose screw. Northwood, Ohio was exactly as you'd picture it. A single main street with a patriotic banner hanging between 2 lampposts, a town square with a gazebo and a slightly lopsided cannon from some long-forgotten war, and the smell of freshly cut grass hanging in the air. For a moment, a wave of self-doubt washed over me. What in the world was I doing here? I was a 68-year-old grandmother on some kind of bizarre spy mission, fueled by hurt feelings and a hunch. I felt foolish. Maybe Dolores really was as perfect as she seemed. Maybe I was the one who was bitter and broken. I checked into a tidy little bed and breakfast run by a woman who looked to be about my age, with kind eyes and a welcoming pot of coffee permanently brewing in the lobby. Her name was Barb. I told her I was in town doing some genealogical research, tracing some distant relatives. It was a flimsy cover, but it was believable enough. "Oh, that's wonderful," she had said. "The Historical Society is right next to the library. They've got all the old records." The first day, I followed Barb's advice. I went to the library, a quiet, sun-drenched building that smelled of old paper and lemon polish. I spent hours hunched over a microfiche machine, my eyes burning as I scrolled through decades-old copies of the Northwood Chronicle. I found Dolores Pringle, that was her maiden name, in the society pages a few times, engaged to her late husband, Thomas, an honor roll mention in her senior year of high school. It was all disappointingly normal. I found her high school yearbook and saw the pictures. There she was, a fresh-faced brunette with a bright, confident smile. Voted most likely to succeed. Captain of the debate team. It was the same curated perfection she projected now, just in black and white. My heart sank. Maybe I'd completely misread everything. That evening, feeling defeated, I went to the town's only real diner, a place called the Corner Booth. I sat with a cup of coffee and a slice of what turned out to be spectacular apple pie, just watching the locals come and go. I was about to give up, to book a flight home and accept my fate as the estranged, forgotten grandmother. Then, the waitress, a woman named Marge with a beehive hairdo that looked like it hadn't changed since 1975, came to refill my coffee. "Just passing through?" she asked, her voice friendly. "Something like that. Doing a little family research. I had a relative from here, from a long time ago, Dolores Pringle." Marge froze, the coffee pot hovering over my cup. A flicker of something I couldn't quite name crossed her face. It wasn't recognition, not exactly. It was more like recollection, like I'd just mentioned a name from a story she hadn't thought about in years. "Pringle," she repeated slowly, her brow furrowing. "Lord, that's a name from the past. Dolores, a pretty girl, but high-strung. Her family had that big old farmhouse out on Mill Road. Always some kind of commotion coming from that place." This was it, the first thread. "Commotion?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. The way she tells it, life here was quiet as can be. Marge let out a short, sharp laugh. "Quiet? Honey, the Pringles weren't quiet. Her father was a drinker. And her mother,
Well, her mother just looked the other way. And Dolores, she had a wild streak a mile wide, always running with that tough crowd, especially that Henderson boy. She shook her head as if clearing away a cobweb. Anyway, that was a lifetime ago. You want more pie? I did not, in fact, want more pie. I wanted more about the Henderson boy. I wanted to know about the commotion. I had names now, a place, a different version of the story. I left Marge a $20 tip on a $3 coffee and went back to my room with a renewed sense of purpose. Dolores Pringle, the wild child from Mill Road, the girl who ran with the tough crowd. This was a narrative I could work with. Her carefully constructed world was about to come tumbling down, and I had my finger on the first brick. Don't go anywhere.
The next morning, I didn't go back to the library. Instead, I went to the county courthouse. It was a stuffy, intimidating old building, but I marched in like I owned the place. I learned from the clerk that property records from the 1970s weren't digitized. They were in massive, leather-bound ledger books stored in the archives in the basement. Perfect. I said I was trying to confirm an old property line for my family's historical records. An hour later, I was in a dusty, dimly lit room pulling a giant book off a shelf that listed all the property transactions for Mill Road. I found the Pringle farm. I traced its ownership back. Then I cross-referenced the names of their neighbors from that era. One name stood out, Miller. I remembered Marge the waitress mentioning that old Mr. Miller had lived next to the Pringles forever. According to the records, a Sarah Miller still owned the adjacent property. A quick search on my phone showed a Sarah Miller, aged 88, still living at that same address. I had my next stop. Pulling up to Sarah Miller's house was like driving into a postcard from the past. It was a small, well-kept clapboard house with a sprawling porch swing and pots of blooming geraniums. An elderly woman with a shock of white hair was gently weeding a rose bush near the steps. I took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth. "Mrs. Miller?" I called out, putting on my most polite and non-threatening smile. She looked up, her eyes a brilliant, sharp blue. "I am. And who might you be?" I gave her my story. "My name is Susan. I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm doing a bit of family history. My daughter-in-law is Dolores Pringle, well, Dolores Evans now. She grew up next door, and I'm putting together a scrapbook for my grandchildren. I was hoping you might be willing to share a memory or two of what she was like as a girl." Sarah Miller's face was unreadable. She stood up slowly, dusting the dirt from her hands onto her apron. She said, "Dolores Pringle," the name sounding foreign on her tongue. "Well, I'll be. Come on up and sit. I'll get us some lemonade." For the next 20 minutes, she gave me the sanitized version. Dolores was a spirited girl, very ambitious, always wanted to get out of Northwood. But as we talked, I could sense she was holding back. I gently prodded. "The waitress at the diner mentioned there was always some commotion around the Pringle house, and something about a Henderson boy." Sarah Miller sighed deeply, the sound seeming to come from the soles of her feet. She stared out at the neat rows of her garden. "That waitress was Marge, wasn't it? She never forgets a thing. It's not my place to go stirring up old trouble." "Of course not," I said softly. "It's just Dolores is the grandmother to my grandkids now, and she acts as if she never made a single mistake in her whole life. She's making my son and my grandchildren think that's the standard they have to live up to. It would be helpful for them to know she was human too." That seemed to strike a chord. Sarah took a long sip of her lemonade. "Human is one word for it," she said cryptically. "Dolores didn't just make mistakes, dear. She buried them. That Henderson boy, his name was Jimmy. He and Dolores were thick as thieves and always in trouble. One night, a real bad night, it all went sideways. Jimmy ended up taking the fall for something they both did. Took the fall, and it ruined his life." My heart was pounding in my chest. What did they do? Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "They got caught breaking into the old pharmacy downtown, stole a couple $100 and a whole lot of prescription pads. But it wasn't a simple robbery. Mr. Abernathy, the pharmacist, came in and surprised them. There was a struggle. He had a heart attack right there on the floor.
He survived, thank the good Lord, but he was never the same. Jimmy had a record, so he went to juvenile hall for 2 years. Dolores, with her debate team trophies and her innocent little act, her parents hired a fancy lawyer. She walked away without a scratch, claimed Jimmy had forced her into it. Everyone who really knew them knew that was a lie. Dolores Pringle was the mastermind behind every bad idea she ever had.
There it was, the loose screw. Not just a loose screw, a whole collapsed support beam in the carefully constructed facade of St. Dolores. A violent break-in, a man nearly dying, a boy's life ruined while she walked away scot-free. This was so much more than I had ever imagined. The satisfaction I felt was immediately followed by a chilling sense of power. I now held the key to the flawless, perfect grandmother's secret history. My hands were shaking so hard, I had to grip the steering wheel with both hands just to steady them. I thanked Sarah Miller, my voice sounding distant and strange to my own ears, and got in my rental car. A pharmacy break-in, a heart attack, a boy's life ruined. This wasn't some petty teenage drama. This was a dark, defining moment that Dolores had meticulously scrubbed from her life story. As I drove back towards town, my initial shock morphed into a cold, hard certainty. I wasn't just doing this for me anymore. This was for Jimmy Henderson, the boy who took the fall, and it was for my son and my grandchildren, who were living under the influence of a woman whose entire persona was built on a foundation of lies. The next morning, I was back at the county courthouse. This time, I knew what I was looking for. I went back to the same clerk who had helped me with the property records. "I have another odd request," I said, leaning in conspiratorially. "My research led me to a crime that happened here in town back in the 70s, a break-in at Abernathy's pharmacy. Do you have archives of criminal cases from that time?" The clerk, a woman whose nameplate read Cynthia, squinted at me. "Juvenile records from that far back are sealed tighter than a drum, hun." My heart sank. "Oh, well, would there be any public records, police reports, newspaper articles?" Cynthia tapped a long painted nail on her desk. "Newspaper archives are at the library, you already know that. But depending on the charge, the case file might have some unsealed documents. What year are we talking about?" Sarah Miller said it was the summer she was 17, so I think that would be around 1974. I guessed. Cynthia typed for a few minutes, her screen invisible to me. "Okay, I got an aggravated burglary and assault case against a James T. Henderson from July 1974. Charges filed by one Albert Abernathy. That sound right?" "That's it," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "The case file is in deep storage. I can put in a request, but it'll take a day to pull it," she said, looking bored. I couldn't believe my luck. It wasn't completely sealed. I filled out the request form with trembling fingers. While I waited, I went back to the library's microfiche machine. Armed with a date, it took me less than 30 minutes to find it. The Northwood Chronicle, July 17th, 1974. The headline was stark. "Downtown pharmacist assaulted during a burglary. Local teen arrested." The story laid it all out. James Jimmy Henderson, 18, had been arrested. Mr. Abernathy, 62, had suffered a massive coronary event during the confrontation and was in critical condition. The final paragraph was the one that made every hair on my arms stand up. Police also questioned a 17-year-old female who was with Henderson at the time. She has not been charged, and her name is being withheld as she is a minor. Sources say she is cooperating fully with the investigation. The cooperating witness, the unnamed minor who walked away clean. I felt a surge of nausea and triumph at once. I printed 3 copies of the article, the grainy black and white image of a handcuffed Jimmy Henderson staring up at me with defiant, terrified eyes. I held 40-year-old secrets in my hands. The question now wasn't what I had, but exactly how I was going to use it. And trust me, the plan that was forming in my mind was better than any movie plot. The next day, the courthouse called. The file was ready.
Cynthia handed me a thin, brittle manila folder. Most of the documents were, as she'd predicted, sealed or redacted, but there were 2 pages available to the public: the official charging sheet against James Henderson and the witness list for the prosecution. And there it was, typed out in faded ink right at the top of the list. Pringle, Dolores Ann, age 17, 124 Mill Road, Northwood, Ohio. It wasn't just a neighbor's gossip anymore. It was here, in black and white. She hadn't just been there, she was the state's key witness against him. She had saved herself by burying him. I took a deep breath and walked over to the courthouse copy machine. I made 5 clear copies of the witness list, 5 copies of the newspaper article. I paid the clerk, my hands perfectly steady this time, and walked out into the Ohio sunshine feeling like I was carrying a bomb in my purse.
My plan needed one final element. I needed to know what happened to Jimmy Henderson. It took some digging online, a combination of old public records and obituary searches, but I finally found him. James T. Henderson had passed away 5 years earlier from a heart attack at the age of 58. His obituary mentioned he had worked for 2 decades as a mechanic at a garage 1 town over, had never married, and had no children. He was survived only by a younger sister, a Brenda Carlisle. My heart ached for him. A 2-year sentence in juvenile hall back then was no small thing. It marked you for life. It clearly had derailed his completely. Dolores, on the other hand, had gone off to college that fall. Captain of the debate team, most likely to succeed, and had never looked back. The last thing I did before leaving Northwood was visit the town cemetery. I found Jimmy's grave. It was a simple, flat stone, his name and dates etched into the granite. The grass was neatly trimmed. Someone was still taking care of it. I stood there for a long time, just looking at it. "I'm sorry, Jimmy," I whispered to the quiet stone. "I can't change what happened to you, but I'll be damned if I let her build her perfect little kingdom on top of your ruined life." I flew home the next day. I laid the copies out on my dining room table. The newspaper article about the robbery, the official court document naming Dolores as the star witness, and the printout of Jimmy Henderson's obituary. This was my ammunition. It was irrefutable. I couldn't just send it to my son, Mark. If it came from me, I would be the villain. Tiffany would spin it as a desperate, jealous act by the other grandma. I had to be smarter than that. The plan was simple, and it was elegant. I took 1 copy of each document and placed them in a plain manila envelope. I bought a sheet of generic return address labels from the office supply store and typed a fictitious name and address onto one. A concerned friend, P.O. Box 123, Columbus, Ohio. My city, but totally anonymous. Then I typed Mark's name and address on the front. I didn't write a note. I didn't need to. The documents spoke for themselves. The story they told was loud and clear. On Monday morning, a week after my return, I drove to a post office in a different zip code, 5 towns away from my house. I was wearing a hat and sunglasses, feeling ridiculous and powerful all at once. I slipped the envelope into the big blue mailbox. As it disappeared with a soft thud, I didn't feel guilt. I didn't even feel vengeful. I felt calm. The truth was now in motion. A 40-year lie was about to land on my son's doorstep, and nothing in his picture-perfect life would ever be the same again. All I had to do now was wait. The 2 days after I dropped that envelope in the mail were the longest of my life. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leapt into my throat. I jumped every time a car drove down my street. I was a bundle of nerves, a condition I am not accustomed to. I kept telling myself I had done the right thing, that the truth has a right to be heard. But there was a small, persistent voice in my head that whispered, "What if this just makes everything worse?" The call came on Wednesday evening. It wasn't Mark's number. It was my daughter-in-law, Tiffany. I almost didn't answer. In the 3 years since her mother had moved to town,
Tiffany had initiated a call to me maybe 5 times. This was either very good or very, very bad. "Susan," she said, her voice high and strained, like a violin string about to snap. There were no pleasantries. "Tiffany, hello, is everything all right?" I asked, my voice a calm I did not feel. "No, everything is not all right," she spat. "My mother is in the hospital." The world tilted. This was not part of the plan. A hospital? What had I done? "Oh my God," I breathed. "What happened? Is she okay?" She had a panic attack, a severe one. Her blood pressure went through the roof because some sick, evil person sent Mark an anonymous package of lies about her, digging up ancient history to try and hurt her, to hurt us. I listened, my knuckles white on the kitchen counter. I could hear Mark's voice in the background telling her to calm down. He got on the phone. "Mom, look, Tiff is obviously upset. Dolores is stable, but she had a bad scare. Did Tiffany tell you what this was about?" I played my part. "She said something about a package, about lies. Mark, what is going on?"
He sighed, a ragged, painful sound. He told me everything. About the envelope, about the newspaper clipping, the court document, the obituary. He described the look on Tiffany's face as she read them, the way all the color had drained from it. He described her explosive anger, her immediate defense of her mother. And then he described the confrontation. He and Tiffany had gone straight to Dolores's house. He had barely gotten the words out before Dolores had clutched her chest, tears streaming down her face, and started gasping for air. The paramedics had to be called. It was a chaotic, traumatic scene. The first cracks in their perfect little world were showing. But what I didn't know was how deep those cracks would go or who else would get pulled into them. Stay with me, because this is where it gets really messy. From the hospital, after she'd been given a sedative, Dolores had spun her story. It was a masterpiece of victimhood. Yes, she had been there, but she was a terrified girl, caught under the spell of a dangerous older boy. Jimmy Henderson had forced her along, threatened her family if she didn't cooperate. She painted a picture of herself as a scared child who did what the police and her parents told her to do, tell the truth to save herself from a monster. The reason she never spoke of it was the trauma, the deep, dark shame of ever having been associated with such a horrible event. It was the secret pain she had carried her entire life, a cross she had to bear. And Tiffany bought every single word. Of course she did. In her eyes, her mother had just gone from being a saint to a tragic, saintly martyr. The anonymous sender of the letter was no longer just a muckraker, but a cruel monster who had intentionally triggered her mother's deep-seated trauma, causing a serious medical event. Tiffany's mission now was to find this person and make them pay. I hung up the phone feeling dizzy. A panic attack? A hospital visit? This was a consequence I had not foreseen. Had I gone too far? For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But then I thought of Jimmy Henderson's simple grave. I thought of my grandchildren being raised under the umbrella of this monumental lie. The guilt evaporated and was replaced by a familiar, cold resolve. Dolores was a performer, and that panic attack was her Oscar-winning scene. And I was not going to be her audience. A week later, Dolores was home and recovering, enjoying a flood of sympathy from everyone in their circle. Tiffany, meanwhile, was on the warpath. She and Mark came over for what he called a family meeting, which I knew was an interrogation. We sat in my living room, the air thick with unspoken accusations. "So," Tiffany began, her eyes scanning my face for any flicker of guilt, "we've been trying to figure out who would do this. Who would have access to this kind of information from our hometown?" I just looked at her, my expression placid. "It sounds like someone with a long memory and a grudge," I said simply. "Exactly," she said, leaning forward, "which is why I have to ask. Have you had any contact with people from Northwood recently?
Did my mom ever mention any old family friends who might have been jealous of her? This was my moment. The truth, or a version of it. I looked her right in the eye. Actually, Tiffany, yes. Now that you mention it, it's a funny coincidence. I was in Ohio about 2 weeks ago. Mark's head snapped up. What? You were in Ohio? Why didn't you tell us? I was doing some genealogical research, I said calmly, pulling the lie I had prepared. Frank's side of the family has roots near Columbus, and I was just doing some digging in a few old town halls. I think I drove through Northwood on my way back to the airport. It was a lovely little place. I let the words hang in the air. I had told the truth. I was there, and I offered it up freely, as if it meant nothing. It was the perfect gambit. Only a guilty person would hide their presence there. An innocent person would mention it as a harmless coincidence. Tiffany stared at me, her mind clearly working overtime. I could see the suspicion warring with confusion. My casual admission didn't fit the narrative of a secret backstabbing enemy. Before she could formulate her next attack, I continued. But the person you should be looking for isn't someone who is jealous of your mother, I said, my voice soft but firm. I looked at my son, Mark Tiffany. The person who sent that letter is almost certainly related to Jimmy Henderson.
They both looked stunned. What? Tiffany whispered. Think about it. Who else would care after 40 years? Who else would have kept those documents, cherished that grudge? A sibling? A cousin? Someone who felt Jimmy's whole life was ruined while the person who was with him got to walk away. The obituary mentioned he had a sister. I let that seed plant itself. I can't imagine her life was easy either. Maybe she's bitter. Maybe she saw your family's perfect life on social media, and she finally snapped. It was brilliant, if I do say so myself. I had given them a new suspect, a plausible, logical, and, most importantly, completely innocent person to blame, Jimmy Henderson's grieving sister. The final act of my plan unfolded over the next month. I called Mark a few days after our meeting. You know, honey, I said, my voice full of concern, I keep thinking about this whole mess. That sister, what was her name? Brenda? Your family needs peace. Maybe you should try to talk to her? I was an angel of reconciliation, helping them clean up the very mess I'd created. Mark, ever the peacemaker, thought it was a wonderful idea. If they could offer their condolences, perhaps make peace, the whole ugly chapter could be closed. He got Brenda Carlisle's contact information, and he and Tiffany and a very reluctant Dolores drove the 2 hours to the next town over to meet her. This is the part of the story I heard from Mark later, in fragmented, horrified pieces. They met Brenda in a small, clean diner. She was a tired-looking woman in her early 60s, with the same defiant eyes as the boy in the newspaper photo. Dolores, propped up by Tiffany, launched into her grand performance, talking about the trauma and the fear and offering her deepest sympathies for the life Jimmy had been forced to live. Brenda Carlisle just sat there, listening silently. When Dolores was finished, her face a mask of tragic sincerity, Brenda took a slow sip of her coffee. Then she looked Dolores dead in the eye. I was there that night, Dolores. I was 15. Jimmy was supposed to be watching me, but you came by, rattling the screen door like you always did. You had the idea for the pharmacy. You said you knew where old man Abernathy kept the emergency cash box. Jimmy didn't want to go. He said it was stupid. But you called him a coward. You dared him. You worked on him for an hour until he gave in, because you knew he'd do anything for you. The air went out of the room. Tiffany started to object, but Brenda held a hand. And after
After Jimmy got out of juvie, he tried to get his life back, but you and your parents had told everyone in town that he was a dangerous thug who forced you. No one would hire him. He couldn't get a loan. He lost everything. My brother wasn't a bad person, Dolores. He was a dumb, love-struck teenage boy who made one terrible mistake, egged on by you. You didn't just walk away clean. You actively participated in destroying what was left of his life to protect your own reputation. The shame isn't that you were there. The shame is that you did nothing to help him after you had saved yourself. You let him drown. Then she slid a small, faded photograph across the table. It was of a teenage Dolores and a teenage Jimmy, laughing, his arm around her. They looked like a couple. He kept this in his wallet until the day he died. Now, I believe this meeting is over. That was it. The entire carefully constructed edifice of lies crumbled to dust on a sticky diner tabletop. There was no argument, no defense. Mark said the ride home was an absolute bone-crushing silence. Tiffany didn't look at her mother once. The fallout was quiet but total. Tiffany and Mark are in therapy now, trying to figure out how to parent children when one of their primary role models has been revealed to be a manipulative fraud. Dolores is still in their lives, but it is a strained, hollow relationship. There are no more glowing social media posts about #bestlolly. There are no more grand pronouncements about parenting. She has been defended. Her power, which was rooted in her perceived moral perfection, is gone. And me? 2 weeks ago, Mark brought Leo and Mia over. He gave me a long hug at the door and whispered, "Thank you." I'm not sure if he knows for certain that I was the one who sent the letter, but I think he understands why it had to be done. I have my grandchildren back. Last Tuesday, Mia and I put on our feathered hats and had fancy tea with real Earl Grey and little cucumber sandwiches. And this weekend, Leo and I are going to finally get that telescope set up in the backyard. We're going to look at the stars, and I'm going to tell him stories about his grandpa Frank. Stories that are real and true. What do you think? Did I do the right thing, or did I go too far? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.
Your watch to the end. Be click here. You will hear another story from my grandma.